Well, now we have Christina Boudreau. Wow, she's already got a fan club. I love it. She's also a whosoever. And her story is called Beautiful Scars. Please welcome Christina.
Thank you, Lisa. Are you ladies having a great time today? Awesome. I seriously love Amor. I had the privilege of meeting her yesterday. We were kind of texting, for a couple of days, and I was like, man, that woman slays for the kingdom, dude. I was backstage having my own revival meeting, so I was just so blessed. So today I'm gonna be sharing with you about the topic of cutting and depression and suicide. And one of my favorite verses is actually found in the book of Revelation, and it says that we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. And as I begin my talk today, I'm going to open up with the spoken word piece that I wrote the night I had my last cutting episode. And it was a piece that God birthed from my pain, and how if we give God our pain, He will give us His peace. And if we give God our trash, He will give us treasure. And so the spoken word piece is called, He Made My Scars Beautiful. They say He makes all things beautiful. But does that mean my scars? Does that mean the wounds on my heart? Does that mean the damage that has been done to my soul? As I stand in the shower, looking down, I see the blood running down the drain like I have seen so many times before. Looking down, I see the razor, blood-stained and flesh hanging from its blade, and there I make another mark on the wall. Another mark next to a myriad of marks. Another mark of pain, another mark of sadness, another mark of brokenness, another mark of failure, another mark on my already wounded soul. Why did I pick up the razor again is the question I ask myself. Closing my eyes in the shower, I see God come my way like I have seen so many times before. Taking my hand in His, He leads me down a hallway of stained glass windows. Walking through the hallway, there is a beautiful light shining through all of these stained glass windows. And as we get to the end of the hallway, He shows me a stained glass window that is half finished. This one is yours, my child, He says. I am piecing back the broken pieces of your life, one by one, to form a beautiful masterpiece so I can shine my light through you for all the world to see, He says. Leading me into a room, I see a big wooden table with all the broken pieces of my life scattered upon it. He shows me that He is removing the dirt from the broken pieces of my life and throwing away all the trash, all the cutting, all the depression, all the suicide, all the sexual abuse, all the anorexia, all the bulimia, all the abandonment. He then shows me His hands that are blood-stained and calloused from piecing back the broken pieces of my life. His hands that were nailed to a tree so that I could be set free. The hands of royalty that bled so that I could be crowned as His child. His hands that were torn open in blood so that mine didn't have to be. Standing in front of the stained glass window, I see a hammer in my hand and glass on the floor. I see that I have shattered what He has so intricately pieced together. Walking up to me, He says, "What have you done with my masterpiece?" Because you see, every time I pick up that razor, I am shattering that stained glass window. Every time I take a blade and run it through my arm, I am destroying His masterpiece. And every time I see the blood running down my arms, I am devaluing what He calls precious, what He calls priceless, and what He calls His own. You see, my friends, He bled so that we wouldn't have to bleed. Scarred so that we wouldn't have to be. And His body was broken so we could be made whole again in His nail-pierced hands. To all the hurting, broken, and abused, you are His masterpiece. You are His Mona Lisa. You are His symphony. You are His melody. You are His stained glass window. And He will not stop piecing you back together until you are whole again. Give Him your scars, and He will make them beautiful. The first time I ever cut myself was at the age of 17. At the time, I was dealing with anorexia and bulimia. I was being verbally abused on a weekly basis and physically abused. You see, I had so much pain in my heart that I didn't know what to do with. I had failed rehab, and the anorexia wasn't cutting it. Throwing up my food wasn't numbing the pain. The painkillers were not numbing the pain. And so I had one thing left, which was a razor. I heard of a girl when I was in treatment that had picked up a razor and she was cutting herself, and I was like, maybe that would take away the pain. And I bent up that blade, and I remember sitting in the closet in my room and tearing up my arms and tearing up my legs. And as I stood in the shower, I screamed because the hot water hit the wounds. And it was then that I felt the pain, because you see, when I cut myself, I didn't feel the physical pain because the emotional pain outweighed the physical pain. But you see, that release was only temporary, because I was then left with the shame from cutting myself, as well as the other pain I was dealing with. It was just a few months after that I was going to start my senior year of college, and I remember sitting in my room one night, and I said, senior of high school, and I remember saying, Lord, I'm not going to make it through college, man. I was the kid who was always in the counselor's office. I was the kid who was supposed to go to juvie hall in the 5th grade, but my pastor bailed me out. I'm just a punk kid who's not going to make it in life, so let me end my life because I don't know how I'm going to make it. Let me do you a favor, God. And it was that night that I said, Lord, if you're real, prove yourself to me. If you're real, heal me of my eating disorders. If you're real, allow your grace to be poured out upon my life, or else I'm going to end my life tonight. And do you know what God did for me that night? In all of his grace and in all of my foolishness, he reached down and radically healed me of 7 years of anorexia and bulimia. I had heard of healing in the Bible, but I encountered Jesus of Nazareth face to face that night. And it was on that night that I felt like God reached out his hands, and he still has his scars from the cross. And in that night, I felt like the Lord said to me, Christina, give your scars to me, because I'm going to make them beautiful tonight. And I want to use your scars to change the world, just like how my scars change the world, because my scars tell a story of healing and redemption and salvation. And you see, there's a Japanese method called kintsukuroi. And it's where they take shattered pieces of pottery and they piece it back together with gold. And it says that the piece is more beautiful for being broken, because as you look in the cracks, you see the gold. And that's what God did with my life that night. With my beauty that was shattered, with my sexuality that was shattered from the sexual abuse, he pieced me back together, and his beauty began to slowly shine through my life. 4 years went by. I was at the age of almost 18 at that time, and at the age of 22, I sat in my room. I had gone through 4 years of college, but you see, the truth is, when I was in treatment for my eating disorder, my counselors said, Christina, there's a lot of underlying issues we're not getting to, girlfriend. We see the eating disorder, but there's a lot of stuff that you're not wanting to be real with. You see, I didn't want to talk about the sexual abuse. I didn't want to talk about the verbal abuse or the mental abuse. I didn't want to talk about any of it, so I put up wall after wall after wall. How many of you built up walls in this room? Mine were higher than Jericho, girl. They were big, big walls. And I was a punk kid, too, so if anyone tried to tear down my walls, I would cuss them out and I would get angry at them. I don't do that no more, though. Jesus set me free from that. And I remember, yeah, for real, though. I remember sitting there at the age of 22, and the Lord basically, for years, my heart was wounded from the abuse. And it was almost like a knife being torn through my heart time and time again. And every time the abuse would hit, every time the rejection would hit, every time a guy at school didn't like me, I took a bandage and I put it over that wound. But how many of you know that when you put a bandage over the wound, it doesn't heal the wound? And medically speaking, doctors say that a wound needs to bleed in order to be healed. And that's what my counselors were trying to get me to do at the age of 16, but I wasn't willing to do that. And so I remember that night, it was basically like I almost had spiritual cardiac arrest, because 22 years of pain came to the surface. that I didn't want to deal with. And for the first time in 4 years, I once again picked up the razor. I was like, I'm not going back to the eating disorders. I'm going to pick up a razor instead. And as I picked up the razor and I cut myself, it once again didn't deal with the pain. And you see, at that time in my life, I said, God, your word says that I am your masterpiece, but I don't feel like a masterpiece. Your word says this, but I don't feel that way. Your promise says say this, but I don't see that in my life, Lord. And it was that night that, I was reading. I love art, all types of art. I'm not a very good drawer, but I love it anyways. And I remember reading the story of the Mona Lisa. And what the Lord began to show me through the Mona Lisa is that, when Leonardo da Vinci died, they took the Mona Lisa and put her in a museum. And someone one day walked by and threw some eggs at her, and the museum people took her down, cleaned her up, put her back on the shelf. Someone else came by and spray painted her, and they took her down, cleaned her up, and put her back on. There came a point where her frame was rotting, so they took her down, gave her a brand new frame, and put her back on. And you see, no matter what happened to her, no matter how badly people treated her, no matter how people didn't see the value in her, that they would do those things to her, she was still called a masterpiece because of who her artist was. And what the Lord began to show me is, Christina, yes, you are my Mona Lisa. And even though the sexual abuse came and hit the painting of your life, I took you down and cleaned you up and put you back on my shelf. Even though the rejection came, I took you down, gave you a brand new coat of paint, and put you back on my shelf. Even though love has failed you in this life, I have taken you down, reframed you in my love, and have placed you back on the shelf. Because my signature sits at the bottom of the painting of your life, and regardless of what people say, you are my masterpiece. And you see, during that season of my life, I was finishing out my 4th year of college. All my friends were graduating, getting married, having kids, going and getting great jobs, and there I was, sitting in my room day after day, cutting myself. Because I didn't see worth in myself. Dealing with 22 years of pain that I didn't know what to do with. I knew that I should have given God my pain, but I tried to deal with it on my own. And I remember during that year of my life, everyone left me. My friends, my church family, my so-called friends, by the way, my church family, my mentors. So many people left me in my life. It's when you go through it that you actually see who's for real. And I remember in that season of my life, I was already dealing with the pain of dealing with the abuse. I was already dealing with the pain of the cutting. I was already dealing with the pain of the shame and all these things. I felt like the whole city of my life got bombed and everything crumbled to the ground. And day after day, I saw God sitting there waiting for me to run to him. And I was like, dude, why are you still here? I'm like the water boy of the football team, man. Is there some other kid who's like getting good grades in school, who's not being transported by police to the psych hospital, whose cops are not showing up at the house every single day to drag you to the psych hospital? I was like, Lord, is there somebody else? Why are you still here, man? Why? And it was in those times of brokenness that the Lord said, I will never stop chasing you. I was barely making it to class my senior year. And you see, there were times where I would cut myself and I wouldn't even wash off the blood. I would just wrap an ace bandage around it, put a sweatshirt on, and pretend like nothing happened. That's how far gone I was. And I remember walking through the LA County Museum of Art that year with one of my best friends. And as I was walking through the LA County Museum of Art, I saw all the sculptures in the LA County Museum of Art that people chipped away and they formed something beautiful. And I remember reading about the famous Michelangelo. How many of you have heard of Michelangelo's David? It's kind of the dude that's going like this, you know? And the story of Michelangelo's David, and I resonated with this because this was my life at that time, is that there is an artist that took this big piece of marble and he began to chip away, but one day he was like, I can't do anything with this, so he threw it in the back of a shed. Michelangelo walked by that big piece of marble one day and was like, I could do something with that. And Michelangelo said, I saw the angel in the stone and I carved until I set it free. And Michelangelo saw King David in the stone and he carved away until what is now called Michelangelo's David. And you see, that's what God did in my life that year. When everyone else had given up on me, he walked by and saw a piece of marble that everyone else had given up on and was like, I could do something with that piece of marble that's in the back of the shed collecting dust. And he put me in front of him. And day after day, he began to chip away at the anger and chip away at the abuse and chip away at my bitterness and chip away at my unforgiveness because he saw a princess in the midst of the stone. He saw a daughter of the king in the midst of the abuse. He saw a daughter of the Most High God, a daughter of royalty in the midst of all of the pain. He saw something beautiful. And again, he would whisper to me at night, I will never stop chasing you. And you see, my senior year, I remember coming home each and every day, and I remember sleeping during the day because there was just a depression that crippled me. I could not get out of bed. I felt a heavy spiritual oppression upon my life. And I remember I would be up all night long doing homework. And there was one specific night that I was up at 3 a.m. just trying to finish out my senior papers, and it was dark outside about 3 a.m. and I heard the birds singing. And I was like, dude, the birds should only be singing when the sun is rising. The sun's not rising yet. Why are the birds singing? And I was thinking the birds are tripping too, dude. It's early in the morning. And it was pitch black outside and the birds are singing. And in that moment, I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, Christina, the birds sing because they know the sun is faithful to rise. And so you also need to worship me in the dark seasons of your life because you need to know that my light will be faithful to shine through your darkness because my light is greater than the darkness, because in Psalm 139, it says that the darkness is not dark to God and the light is as bright as the day. And so from that day forth, for about 4 months, every single night for about 4 hours, I would get on my knees and worship the Lord in the midst of my depression, in the midst of my anger, in the midst of my suicidal thoughts. I worshiped the Lord. And there came a moment where I felt like I had no more worship left in me. Every day I would wake up with an image in my head of a noose around my neck hanging from a ceiling fan. And it was on that day that I was like, Lord, you promised that you would meet me, but I don't feel you here and I don't see you here. And so I'm just going to end it all because I can't fight anymore. But you see, that day, God's love did not abandon me on the battlefield. I remember taking my dog's leash and putting it around the beam in my garage. And it was on that day that I was like, Lord, I'm done, man. I'm done. Nobody cares. Everyone has left me. So what value do you see in my life? And in the moment that I was about to jump off what I was on to hang myself, I felt the presence of God surround me. And he said, I will never let you go. And in that moment, my dad and my brother came into the garage. Christina, what are you doing? Grabbing the rope from me, sitting me down, and telling me, don't you dare try to do this because you are valuable to us. That day, the light of God was faithful to shine through. That day, as I worshiped in my darkness, God's light shone. Even at the very last second, he was faithful to come. He was faithful to come. And you see, in that season of my life, things didn't really get much better from there. I remember going to the Lord and saying, Lord, I feel like an old wooden ship whose sails are withered, whose wood is rotting, whose paint is fading. Because you see, even in that season of my life, I had suicide attempt after suicide attempt after suicide attempt. I tried to overdose on painkillers. That didn't work. I tried to swallow OxyClean and soft scrub. In the moment that I picked up the bottle and put it to my mouth, I got a phone call from a number that I had no idea, and no one was on the other line. You bet that was Jesus, girl. You bet that was Jesus. And I was like, man, Lord, like, you won't let me go. He won't let me go. And you see, even in that season of my life, when I felt like everything had crumbled to the ground, the Lord reminded me the year before of when I was at Boston Harbor with my dad. My dad's from New Hampshire. He's like a really tall white dude. And my mom's from Malaysia, so it's like very big contrast between petite and like tall. And I remember going to Boston Harbor with my dad. And at Boston Harbor, there's an old wooden ship that sits there called the USS Midway. And it's the oldest sailing ship, naval ship in the United States. And the year before I was there, I remember just walking on deck and, looking at the ship. And next to the ship, there was a museum that had all the stories of the battles the ship had fought. And I remember I took home like an anchor as like kind of a cool like emblem or whatever. And I brought it home and I put it on a necklace, and I thought it was cool, but it really wasn't. I tattooed it instead. It was just too bulky. I just didn't vibe with it. I was like, it's cool, someone else likes it. But the Lord, one day, I remember sitting at my school at the end of 2012 and saying, Lord, you've saved my life I don't know how many times this year. I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. But I feel like I can't fight anymore, Lord. I've gone through too much in my life. I've battled so much with my sexuality, with the abuse, with the eating disorders. I was like, Lord, how much can one human being take before they're done? I felt like my soul was withered. I felt like an 88-year-old woman, even though I was only 22 at the time. Failed rehab, all of that. But I remember that day that the Lord reminded me of the USS Midway USS Constitution, the Midway's in San Diego, the USS Constitution that I saw at Boston Harbor the year before. And you see the story of the USS Constitution, it's the oldest sailing ship. And at the time, the USS Constitution was used to fight many battles for the United States, back when George Washington was alive. But there came a time where her wood was rotting, her sails were torn, her paint was fading. And so they were going to dismantle the ship and use it to build houses and many other things because it cost too much to repair her. The colonies at the time didn't have enough money. But there was a poet named Oliver Wendell Holmes that stepped forward and saw value in her when no one else did. And he wrote a love letter to the American people and told them about the value that was found in this ship. And the American people, through that, raised money and they restored her. Now she sits at Boston Harbor and people from all over the world come and hear the stories of the battles that she fought. And the Lord that day on my school campus reminded me, Christina, you might feel like this ship, but guess what? Even though your wood is rotting, even though your sails are torn, even though your paint is fading, I was the Oliver Wendell Holmes that stepped forward on the cross 2,000 years ago and wrote a love letter to you in my blood that told the world of your value so much that you were worth dying for. And you know what the Lord did is that the Lord restored the rotting wood in my life. The Lord repaired my torn sails. The Lord has given me a brand new paint job. And together, me and my captain have sailed strong for the last 4 years, all because of his grace. And even that year, as I felt like I was sinking, he was like, no. I am your captain. And on the cross, I defeated all the armies of hell when I said, it is finished. So you fight from a place of victory. And I remember that year, the Lord showing me, Christina, I not only want to make your physical scars beautiful, but I want to make your emotional scars beautiful too, because as the Lord began to slowly peel off the bandages and heal the wounds of abuse, heal the wounds of rejection, heal the wounds of a distorted sexuality, heal the wounds that my eating disorder brought, those wounds became scars, and those scars are beautiful because they tell a story. And it wasn't easy allowing the Lord to heal my heart. And there were days during that year that I chose to cut myself instead of allowing the Lord to heal my heart. But you see, what I have found is that those who deal with cutting or self-harm are usually the most artistic people in the world, through music or writing or poetry or dance. And instead of using their art to display God's beauty, they choose to hurt themselves. That is such a lie of the enemy. But I wonder what would happen if we chose to not pick up the razor or blade, and if we chose to write a poem, if we chose to paint an art piece, if we chose to write a song, what damage we could do for the kingdom of God together. What damage? And you see, one of my favorite passages is found in Ezekiel 37. And it's where there's a valley of dry bones. And a lot of, my life, I have felt like that valley of dry bones. I have felt like most of my life I spent sitting in a grave of my grief, a grave of my pain, a grave of my addiction, a grave of failure. But in that verse, Jesus says, I will open up your grave. I will raise you up from your grave. I will pour my spirit in you and cause you to walk in my way. And I want to encourage you girls today that God wants to take your graveyard of grief and turn it into a garden of hope. Because my life is no longer a graveyard, it is a garden of God's beauty. And healing is a continual process, like I have learned in my life. And as I close in this, my biggest story of cutting that year, I had my whole life fell to the ground in the area of school and ministry and friends and family. All the buildings of my life got bombed to the ground. And I remember that year being like, God, how are you going to rebuild all of it? But in Isaiah, God says that he will raise up the ancient ruins. He will build up the former devastations of many generations. And you know what? God has built up my life, and it is 10 times bigger and more powerful than what it was before. God's plan B was greater than my plan A. And Satan regrets the day he ever messed with me, because there is a reputation that I have in hell as a warrior of light. And girls, if you allow God to heal you and restore you and surrender your bitterness and broken at the foot of the cross, you will live from a place of victory. I had 2 of my siblings in the last month that I almost lost to suicide. The war is still raging in my life, but you know what? As the Lord fought for me, so you bet, girl, I am battling for them on my knees. Because hell will not have their souls. And I will battle, and I will intercede, and I will worship through their darkness for them, because I believe that God has an amazing plan for their life. So all of you girls here today who are thinking, if I just end it, the world would be a better place, that is a lie from the pit of hell. You were created to know the greatest love of all time, and that is the love of Jesus. The love of the one. You are his poem, girlfriend. You are his artwork, and maybe you feel like you're in the back of the closet like the Mona Lisa, like the Michelangelo's David. But God dusts you off, and he places you on the mantle in his fireplace, and he smiles upon you because you are so beautiful to him. So I want to encourage all of you today to give God your scars, whether they are emotional scars or physical scars. And he will make them beautiful, because that is your story. Thank you.
Holy cow. I couldn't even read a novel as beautiful as that, right? I'm like back there going, what? I met her years ago. I'm like, what happened to this girl? Amazing, amazing story. She loves art, doesn't she? And you are all a beautiful work of art. In Psalm 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I know it's been shared, I want to say pounded in your head today, but you know what? Hopefully it's been pounded into your hearts about how much God loves you and how beautiful that you are and how fearfully and wonderfully made that you are and that God has a plan for you. And we are so critical of ourselves. You know, I was sending a picture, a selfie. You know, we do the selfie thing. And this software program popped up, make yourself look better, or whatever the words were. I was like, oh. And I went to tap on it, and I thought, what am I doing? You know? Everything, you know, you stand in line, you look at the Cosmopolitan or whatever those magazines are, and these airbrushed girls, and I think to myself, I'll never look like that. And the pressure of who we think we need to be is so heavy, not only on young women, it's on young men too. But God doesn't pressure you to be anybody than who He made you to be. And He molded you and shaped you to be just who you are.